some good ones. So we're dedicating time to this because it's an issue which is quite core to the podcast anyway. I don't have to justify this. We're going to continue and you will listen. Anyway.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello friends, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by George Hoare in London.
Indeed. You're also at the end of the tax year over there in Brazil, right?
Yeah, tax deadline day.
Tax doesn't have to be taxing, but sometimes it is.
But it often is, especially you have last minute changes to make it to your tax declaration. All fun stuff. Maybe we'll talk about the administrative state as we go through this, though. Maybe not any griping about our personal tax issues. Lee Jones, also in London, joining us today. Hello.
Hello. Thankfully, not having to do my taxes at this moment in time.
It's good in Britain. It's like all payrolled automatically, especially, I guess if you're...
Listeners should be clear, that's not Lee not paying taxes. He's just, we're not at the end of the tax year here in the UK. So
yeah, obviously all of my taxes go through the Cayman Islands.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe that's what I should have done.
All the Kremlin gold goes into my account there and all gets sorted out.
It gets swallowed up by the Caymans. I don't know. I think we're doing just terrible pun, because it's got a big jaws, the Cayman. Anyway, so what we're talking about today, we're going to talk a little bit about Trump's war on Harvard, though more in the context of kind of what universities represent rather than the specific free speech issues, because we will deal with that in a future episode. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Also, the end of the 1960s, which is a topic which has come up this month in other discussions, particularly about class and culture, which we didn't get a chance to deal with properly. So we're going to deal with it here, and then we're going to move on to your questions and comments over the past month. We have a lot to discuss in the letters to the editor section. We have discussions about lawfare, video games, wokeness, mangoes and PMC, and much else besides. So looking forward to doing this. To start off, there's lots of concern about white genocide. The Trump administration has adopted this kind of Afrikaner concern, and people dismiss it. But, Elon Musk has just been taken out by a colored man. Orange man, obviously. Orange man, bad. Right, bad. Anyway.
I think that's a good joke. I found that funny.
That's good. I hope people just cut it like... Well, it's fortunate that I edit this, so I don't have anyone cutting it and making me just sound like a terrible racist and conspiracy theorist. Anyway, I think that whole thing is very to the point of the kind of radical rights culturalist focus, MAGA and, its cousins in Europe. As we've pointed out a number of times on this podcast, the national populists are increasingly part of the furniture of Western politics rather than an insurgent force. And one of the notable ways that they've conformed once they've entered government is through, in the more obvious political and policy sense, support for the Atlantic Alliance, fiscal orthodoxy, etc., to the extent that you kind of go, well, what's populist and populism anymore? But I think equally notable is what they actually push on, right? Not what they kind of fail to do as insurgents, but where they continue to break taboos. And I think they do break. And that's on questions of language, culture, and history. And I thought we might try to think through, some other examples of this. I've mentioned this in a recent piece I've written. I think we've discussed this on the podcast. When we had David Broder on this month, it was mentioned. And in fact, he's written a fair bit about that as well in reference to Italy, where Meloni probably is like the front runner or the leader in paving a path for the radical rights kind of conformity, or it's kind of much more, traditional conservatism. So, tries to kind of make Mussolini seem like not such a bad guy. And lots of ways in which the whole post-war order in Western Europe and the kind of verities that it rested on or accepted consensual truths about the Second World War, about fascism and so on, are being kind of poked holes in, I think. Obviously, this is like more forthrightly done in Eastern Europe, where their alibi for going, maybe the fascists weren't so bad, is to point at Soviet communism and say, well, we were dominated and invaded and had our whole societies reconfigured by this alien invasion by the Soviets. And therefore, we need to be confronting, in our memorialization of the past, confronting both victims of Soviet communism and Nazi fascism. So that's their alibi. In Western Europe, they don't have that. And nevertheless, there's a kind of a breaking down of that post-war consensus. And I think that's, on the one hand, I don't know what you guys' immediate response to that is. But my feeling is kind of like, I don't want to get drawn into the culture war on that. On the other hand, you don't want to just bow out of any battle over what the past and the historical record was.
I mean, what you said, the kind of dual victimization, I think, we've discussed this many times on the podcast, but the way that people try to claim authority or priority today is to say they're victims, the culture of victimhood. And the striking thing, I think it's been discussed recently, is the way the right is doing that. I don't think that's an entirely new thing, though. I remember interrailing in Eastern Europe about 20 odd years ago now. And it was very interesting to see the different ways that Eastern European societies had dealt with the Soviet legacy. And what you were talking about there just kind of triggered this memory. The Hungarians in particular, the way that they have done it is they've created a House of Horrors museum, which is the old secret police.
Mm.
By the Germans, and then we were colonized by the Soviets, and now we're free, but poor us. And what's interesting about that is the way that it just disclaims any agency, right? And in fact, obviously, the Hungarians were deeply involved in the fascist project, and many Hungarians were deeply involved in the Soviet project. But you externalize it and you say, well, we're complete victims. And of course, the historical record does matter. The manipulation of history is a key part of legitimation strategies and of politics. You can't get drawn into every single culture wars battle because it's incredibly tedious. But, when Trump sits there in the Oval Office confronting Ramaphosa with images of white genocide in South Africa and saying, every cross on this image is a grave. Well, it's not, right? One person was killed in that area, and then other people put crosses there as a memorial to draw attention to this issue. But in the statistics, people being murdered on farms, it's a tiny, tiny, vanishingly small proportion of the overall deaths in South Africa. South Africa's massively violent, but most of the victims are black.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, the focus on culture is something that we discussed when Mike Williams came on to talk about his book on the radical right. And I guess it kind of comes from this, listeners will have heard me talk about this quite a lot, but from a particular reading of a culturalist reading of Gramsci's idea of hegemony and, Andrew Breitbart's famous or infamous dictum that politics is downstream of culture. And so I think there's a kind of explanation for why, within the kind of ideological framework of the radical right, as to why focus on culture. But often what it ends up being is, like, exactly as you were saying, Alex, you don't change the kind of the big items, the Atlantic Alliance or fiscal orthodoxy. Instead, it's things which don't really challenge the structures of power quite so much. It's not that they're unimportant, but whether this is in this textbook or that kind of author is on this literature syllabus is not quite of the same order as to whether you're in NATO or not. So it does end up being kind of cultural radicalism for conservative politics quite a lot of the time. And it's like, no, we're still challenging the new class. And this is what Mike talks about in his book, who do tend to have quite culturally radical positions. But ultimately, it's not, it's not quite the big ticket items.
I mean, it was very present in Brazil under Bolsonaro, and indeed the kind of Bolsonarista movement, to the extent that it's still a cohesive whole, still pushes this line in trying to re-enchant the dictatorship period effectively, right? And that breaks an important progressive consensus that was formed at the end of the 1980s and democratization, which the dictatorship was bad, we're moving on. It actually speaks to, at least in Brazil, the way that the dictatorship was never properly dealt with. You had a very belated Truth and Reconciliation Commission under Dilma, so that was kind of decades later. But you never really had the holding to account of the generals for torture, for dictatorship, etc. And that failure of historical reckoning ends up coming back to bite you in the ass down the road. So although there's a progressive consensus, it can be eroded quite easily because there's a lot of still institutional power held by those who perpetuated the dictatorship. So this ends up being an argument, I guess, that I'm making, not to engage in culture war, but that you kind of at some point do need to put your foot down and not just have this fought out kind of discursively, but through actual institutional change with regard to the legacies of the past. And I guess it's telling that in Italy, it's easier for Meloni to talk up, not to talk up Mussolini, but to kind of soften the historical record of fascism in the public memory than it would be for the AfD to do in Germany, right? Although there's also discussions about the kind of breaking of taboos. Anyway, moving on from this specific topic, I think it's notable that what has come off the back of Trump's failure on tariffs is this war on Harvard, which is currently, I mean, that's kind of one of the big stories of the month. And we're going to talk about that in detail in just a second. But I want to make reference to an excellent essay by someone called Lee Jones, which is lead essay in American Affairs this quarter. You will have found that argument in advance of its publication on this very podcast a couple of weeks ago when Lee and I talked through what Trump's strategy and what MAGA's strategy was with the tariffs, their perspective that it was kind of no lose, but actually that it would fail on its own terms. That's me trying to summarize the argument, but I'm going to actually allow Lee promote his essay, and I think people should go and read it anyway because it's very systematic working through. You'll have found the argument on this podcast before, but I figure it's worth giving Lee a chance to sum up again what this case against the Trumpian tariffs is.
It's long, but I'll do my best to summarize it very briefly.
The political argument, not all the detail.
Yeah, so
2 sentences maximum. Come on, we've got we've got other things to talk about. So the sentences can be quite long, but not like
probably will be long,
not
me,
5 or 6 semicolons in each of them.
So there's two broad positions on the tariffs that a lot of people will have encountered. One is that Trump's basically an idiot, and the other is that there's some secret master plan, and the first camp denounced the second camp as sane washing. What I try to do is to take the Trumpists seriously and to kind of get into their speeches and their writing and understand what their worldview is, what they think has gone wrong with the American political economy, and how they think tariffs might solve those problems. But then I still say that I think the world today is characterized, world politics is characterized today by what I call the 4 Ds: denial, disavowal, delusion, and above all, decay. Because of all those things operating, this is not a grand strategy. It's not coherent. The MAGA wonks are not in charge, and the policies won't work on their own terms.
Nice.
Who is in charge if the MAGA wonks aren't in charge?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, to some extent, nobody's in charge in the conventional sense, right? The conventional sense is you'd have a policy-making machine that would work up proposals, and they'd work their way up the chain to the president's desk, and they, his top advisor would thrash it out, and then a decision would be made. But I think, just based on what we saw in the first term and what we've seen so far, a lot of it seems like the second Reagan term, where Reagan was senile by his second term, and his advisors would compete to speak to him last because he would always go with them because that's the only thing that he could remember. And I think there's this element of kind of the courtiers basically around Trump. So whoever's got his ear on a particular day, and ultimately Trump is the decision maker. So if he says we're going to increase tariffs or decrease tariffs, it happens, and he has a cadre of people around him. But there's no, so in a sense, Trump is in charge, but you can't run a country effectively without a coherent state apparatus and a cadre to manage the state. And he has more of a cadre this time, but there's no strategy. It's still very fragmented, and a lot of these battles being waged, I think, on an ongoing basis.
I mean, it's funny when you think of political satire all the way from Dr. Strangelove through to like late 90s Wag the Dog, through to In the Loop. You might sometimes encounter the criticism of those satires that they're a bit broad, they're a bit crude. And then, you have stories exactly like Lee recounted around Reagan's senility. And you're like, yeah, maybe they're too sophisticated, those satires. It actually is a lot dumber. It also makes me wonder, is that what sane washing is? Because like I just feel like public discourse is so filled with so many of these neologisms and things which seem to emerge from TikTok. And that I'm always a little bit like, what does that actually, hang on, I have to think through myself. What does that actually mean to sane wash something? That you're taking something which is insane and you're making it seem sane? Surely
think
there's a
that's what
simpler way to portray that.
Well, yeah, I suppose there might be. I mean, whitewashing, greenwashing, sane washing. I don't know the origin of the term, but I think it's a dangerous term because it suggests there's no possibility of explaining something. Whereas I think what we've got to try to do today is to explain the decay and the delusion and all the rest of it, like this podcast has been trying to do for the last 7 or 8 years, is to explain what's going on. And you have to explain the apparent erratic, the apparent insanity also demands an explanation. You can't just dismiss it and say, oh, well, it's all insane, because then what can you do? That's a counsel of despair. You can't understand it, let alone do anything about it.
Right, indeed.
That's
vote for the sane people. I mean, that's obviously the liberal progressive response, right? Vote for the adults in the room.
I think that was kind of a bit patronizingly. You were kind of explaining why you have to explain things. It was like explain-splaining. Not, I mean, done by a man as well, but it was very
even worse.
You were kind of
it's okay to be a man now. Like wokeness is over. It's okay. You're allowed to be a man.
I think our listeners, I give them a bit more credit. They know why things have to be explained. They're in the loop. Anyway.
First explanation. How about this? I mean, this whole episode with the tariffs has thrown up a lovely acronym. Apparently it's being used on Wall Street, and it's TACO. And apparently Trump went apoplectic when he heard about it, which is Trump always chickens out. And it's great. And it's like, well, that's, obviously the, forever MAGA defenders will reinterpret all Trump's actions as a master plan, which I guess is the flip side to the declaration that it's all insane and there's nothing you can do about it. Is like, well, there's always this master plan behind it. Trump didn't chicken out. He actually took one step, it's 40 chess, et cetera, et cetera. But I think probably the more correct explanation for it, though correct me if you have a different one, it's that this is just the inevitable consequence of when tactics Trump strategy entirely, no pun intended with use of Trump. I mean, that tactics are all that there is, and there is very little in way of strategy. And when I think about that description, the person that comes to mind is less Trump actually, but Angela Merkel, who is famously described as kind of just tactics, right? Just constant little adjustments in response to events as a way of constant kind of crisis fighting in a way that she comes out looking kind of clever, in control. I was going to say demure. Demure is not the right word, but sanguine and kind of, mummy's in charge, right? That was the whole sell of Angela Merkel. And she's the central politician of the last stages of the end of history, I think. I think we can all agree on that. And she was characterized by pure tactics, no strategy. And Trump, on the other hand, is a key politician of the early stages of the end of history. Likewise, lacking any genuine strategic commitment. But his tactics are different. His tactics are much more aggressive and deliberately divisive, whereas Merkel's was in view of creating a kind of consensus and excluding a minority. So, probably her biggest single unilateral move was the acceptance of the refugees in 2016. Is it 2016? Is that right? Yeah, 2016. And that move was done in such a way as to isolate those who were against it as kind of, racists. So it's interesting, I think, to think about two politicians who are both extremely tactics-led with no kind of strategic considerations, except the tactics are carried out in a different way and to different ends, one for consensus, one for division.
I mean, you could expect that maybe tactics will increasingly trump strategy to the extent that you have individual politicians who are not so strongly tied to political parties or social bases, or, as kind of the void takes over, because then it's more like instinct or response rather than like, here's a plan, here are the people that we're really kind of committed to as our kind of constituents that we need to represent and be accountable towards. Instead, it's a bit more, it's a bit more vibes based than kind of strategy based. I mean, I don't know if that is actually true or not, but I think there is there would seem to me at least to be a link between whatever strategy would be and the kind of requirements of like the long-term project of your political party. And if you're someone like Trump, who's basically exploded the political party that he's nominally associated with, then you don't really have that. You don't have to like, here's the long-term strategy of the Republicans. Trump's like, well, fuck that.
Well, I don't know.
I've got my red hat.
I don't know if he's exploded the party though. He's reconfigured it around him
taken it
and
over.
his MAGA project. Yeah, and ultimately, the American political parties aren't political parties in any real sense of the word, anyway. So, I mean,
the point you make about tactics is a kind of enticing one, but I do think the difference is in terms of ends. So Merkel was just trying to keep everything staying the same, effectively, right? Buying time, as Wolfgang Streeck might say. And Trump is genuinely trying to disrupt things. I think, you hear people saying, oh, he doesn't care about anything except himself. He just wants to make money. It's all a grift. I don't think that's really true. I don't think that's ever a very good explanation of why people do things. I think he's genuinely trying to make America great again from his own idea of what that means. He wants to disrupt things. He does have a view that America's being ripped off. He does want to reconfigure globalization and reboot American hegemony. I think he does want all of these things, but he doesn't have a strategy for doing it. As you say, a set of tactics. And so that's
I think
why
that underscores the point.
They appear to be such different figures.
No, but I think we're kind of pushing at the same thing. Trump is the politician of the end of history. So his pure tactics is in pursuit of disruption rather than maintenance and consensus. Anyway, interesting. Just know what you think about this, because there's something kind of, I think just one other thing, actually. Something I came across just this week. I wasn't aware of it, but The Economist chose as its, I'm apologies for citing The Economist. It's a term that shouldn't even pass my lips on this podcast, but their word of the year for 2024 was kakistocracy. I think I have a piece on this coming out in a magazine next month. I'll link to it, but that was chosen obviously because of Trump, right? And when you look up kakistocracy, generally people are attacking. It's generally kind of centrist liberals attacking the populist right. If Trump hadn't won, if Kamala Harris had won, The Economist was going to choose vibes or brat as its word of the year of 2024. I don't think that requires any further comment.
I hate The Economist so much.
Imagine, I think brat would have been absolutely unforgivable. Like, it would be, instead of a brat summer, we would be like, it'd be a brat dictatorship. You can imagine like 100 years, the third brat Reich or something. I don't know. I need to think a little bit more about how
come back to us. Come back.
Yeah. Rebranded. But yeah, why did you get us talking about The Economist?
I apologize. But anyway, we've done episodes on Vibe. Actually, we had this discussion with Anna Kornblue about kind of vibes, and follow on from that, kind of presenting an alternative case for immediacy today and why everything is vibes based. But I think that's another good example to pat ourselves on the back to say, well, no, this needs to be explained. It's not just that everything is vibesy today. There's a reason for that. There's a materialist explanation for it. Anyway. To move us on, just quickly on Harvard, we're going to have an episode which will be recorded next week. It will be with you, listener, within 2 weeks, with Alex Gurevich about his excellent piece on universities, protest, free speech, and how that interlinks with anti-Semitism, accusations of anti-Semitism, the war in Gaza, and so on. So I don't want to do that aspect of it because we're going to deal with that separately. But I do want to ask Lee what his interpretation of Trump's war on the universities is, particularly in light of the fact that you, with Philip Cunliffe, co-authored this report a couple of years ago on UK universities, proposing certain reforms. I don't know where you stand on this now, because I think there's a lot of people on, I don't want to say our side of the spectrum, because that's a bit, but, left-wing critics of the left, to put it that way, for lack of another way, will be pretty down on the university and the central role that it has come to play in Western economies, culture, and society. And some people are like, screw them. Let's get rid of the universities. They're done. Other people are like, they need serious reform. I think any position outside of that, which is like, hey, universities are basically fine or stupid and shouldn't be listened to. So we're more in the kind of reform versus destruction options. Lee, where do you stand?
Well, Phil and I called for radical reform, which would include shrinking the higher education sector and building out a tertiary education sector based around vocational skills, restoring that which had been lost in the UK in the 1990s when polytechnics were converted into universities, and restoring a kind of practical non-academic mode of education and stopping so many young people being funneled into universities and being laden with enormous amounts of debt, restoring the state funding of tertiary education, and democratizing universities above all else, restoring governance to academics and taking it away from the corporate councils or equivalent bodies that have basically taken them over. The whole point of that report was to say the dreams of both the left and the right around universities have totally failed. So all of the things that universities were supposed to have done in the end of history period, like transitioning us to a knowledge economy and promoting social mobility, whether you're kind of coming at it from the right, employability, economic growth, or whether you're coming at it from the left, it's all about equal access and social mobility. None of that has worked. So it's no wonder that people increasingly hate universities, because they don't do what they're tasked with doing, in large part because, like schools, you can't expect education to do all the things that people expect it to do. So we just say, look, it's both sides have completely failed in the way that they've corrupted and perverted the university. And we don't really talk about the culture wars in that report at all, partly because we were writing it in the teeth of the COVID pandemic, and it looked like universities were going to fall over. Crisis was postponed, and now in the UK, it's hitting in a big way. There's massive redundancies in universities. But I think, what's going on in the States in particular, and the resentment that a lot of people have towards universities, is not simply because they failed economically. It's because of what they represent culturally. And this relates back to what we were talking about at the top of the show. And I think this is largely because, structurally, why do we have culture wars? Well, we're not having economic wars, right? So left-right contestation over the economy is basically evaporated. Everything's converged on a neoliberal basis. And even today, when neoliberalism is mutating in new ways, it's really surprising how little has changed since 2008. But the war is all on the cultural side, progressives versus conservatives. And that's the plane on which the left has triumphed, right? So progressive neoliberalism becomes the ideology of the ruling class, and the university becomes the kind of the linchpin of that. And it trains a whole cadre of people to go out into society. And it essentially preaches to people that if you don't think about the world in the right way, if you don't speak about the world in the right way, then you're stupid. And the material side of that is also, universities used to be 5% of people go to universities. Now it's 50% in the UK. It's about a third in the US. So it used to be a tiny elite would leave school at 18 and go on to university, good for you. Now it's half of people do. And so the half that are left behind are also made to feel like they're useless losers as well. So no wonder people don't.
And there's
like
a good chunk of that half
universities.
that do go to university who don't see their ambitions and dreams fulfilled.
And that's the downwardly mobile PMC part that we've talked about a lot on this podcast. So I think, there's a lot of resentment towards universities. A lot of it is well founded. But my own experience is like, there's lots of problems in universities, lots of people doing really stupid stuff in universities. But also it's the only space really in society where you can get paid to think and research and write and teach relatively independently. I mean, okay, you can do some of those things on a podcast, but
a
the
lot of
private
people
sector will not support that. The public sector will not support that. That's the role of universities, and that requires academic freedom. And that's where restoring academic freedom was a huge part of our report as well.
I mean, a lot of people tell me that this is no longer the case, and that I shouldn't, as someone who had aspirations to go into academia, should have no regrets in looking at academia, somewhere where you can independently pursue thought and research.
Well, look, I spent 2 years seconded into the UK government, right? So I saw what the state was like up close. And I left with relief to go back to universities, even though they're in a terrible state, even though they're so corporatized and corrupted, because at least it's a space where you can decide what you want to research and you can pursue it. Now, yes, under very straitened circumstances, that freedom is constantly being crimped and constrained. But I still think that's the strongest defense of universities, is that They are, ideally, they're independent of state power. Ideally, they're independent of corporate power. Academic freedom is the principle that maximizes that space and pushes out interference. So it's a constant battle, and it's a diminishing space, no doubt about that. And it's being diminished from within by academic opponents of academic freedom. They are the worst of the worst. But I still think that you've got to cling on to the core, even as it's shrinking.
George.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't want to ventriloquize Phil, but I think in some of his kind of expressions or summaries of that report, he's put a rather finer point on it with his Phil Pottism and his stated desire to send all the academics into the field. So yeah, maybe there's just a divergence of thinking.
Although if you think about it, you were to ventriloquize him, you'd have to shove your hand up his ass. So there is that.
Yeah, I guess I was more saying
Horrible image.
like metaphorically, like present opinions of his, like I know what he was
I might
saying.
have to cut that out. Jesus.
You can get an AI bot to do his voice now anyway. You don't need
True. This is true.
foul
Anyway, if
No,
George,
I
last comment on this before we move on.
No, I'm just looking to discussing Harvard with Alex, and I will be pronouncing it with a proper Boston accent like that throughout the whole of the episode.
I already know one listener who will be writing in to complain about this. Anyway, one last point before we move on to your questions. And the university is quite central to this because I have this hypothesis, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, that we're living through the end of the 1960s. The long 1960s, the legacy of the 1960s. And by the 1960s, just to be clear, I don't mean obviously the 10 years that happened at some point in the post-war era, but specifically that decade of rising expectations, of mass protest, of the counterculture, of the insurrections of 1968, and the legacies of that, particularly the kind of march through the institutions of former radicals and the cultural, social, and indeed political and economic effects that's had, and the role that it's played also in neoliberalism, or to use the term of Boltanski and Capello's famous book, The New Culture of Capitalism, a capitalism which certainly at its apogee and then was all about flexibility, self-expression, and so on. I think the mood music has changed on that. And in fact, that might be one of the reasons that I think the 1960s is ending. The reason that this also works as a kind of segue is because the university is a very critical institution to this whole story, both in terms of being the site of campus protest in the 1960s itself and setting a mode of politics which the New Left kind of carried through in its history through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the post-political left carried on as well. A form of protest which often was centered on transgression, on cultural transgression, on shock. And the university also played an important role in being essential to the knowledge economy, which a lot of those kind of 60s radicals came to support as a kind of positive vision of the future as they conformed to a future which would be capitalist, not post-capitalist. Anyway, so there's a lot of strands here, and I don't pretend to kind of try to capture them all in a kind of my description of it. And I probably wouldn't do a good job of it unless I had kind of written it down. The point that I want to make, though, is that this was a topic that I wanted to discuss with Christopher Lash's Angry Ghost, our guest in an episode this, but who recently posted something in reference to a conversation we had off camera or off microphone about the end of the 1960s, which is that, actually maybe the 1960s indeed are drawing to a close. People's increasing impatience with the adversary culture, the assumption that every traditional form must be subverted as a matter of course, a weariness creeping in, people just wanting order. And I wonder what your guys' take on this is, and I think that is certainly part of the story. Maybe I can unfold this a bit before you guys come in. I think the kind of end of the long 1960s, the 1960s, which has lasted, what is that, 60 years, something like that, a whole, era within capitalist modernity is maybe coming to an end. And we do a lot of periodization, obviously, on this podcast, and there's different ways to slice up history, and we do it partly in terms of the end of history and the end of history. But there's other time scales, and I think this one from the 1960s through to 2020 might be an important one. So in calling time on the 1960s, what do you mean by that? I mean, there's a very simple fact that the generation of the 1960s, the baby boomers, is sunsetting. And so their influence in society. And they were a large generation. And in most Western societies, this is important. This is why they were called the baby boomers. It was a product of a baby boom. There's a whole bunch of them. And now they are retired, dying, etc., leaving public life at the very least. And so that has its role as, has its influence as a cohort leaves public life. Secondly, the transgressive stance against the mainstream or the establishment now is a stance which belongs as much to the right as it does to the left, arguably even more so to the right. And I think in tandem with that mode of transgression being generalized, it's also become played out, worn out. It's become exhausted. And I think you can see this even like on the right. So you have figures like Jordan Peterson, who's like Nietzschean and edgy, and now talks about defending Christian civilization, which was exactly what Nietzsche set out to critique. So even the kind of right-wing transgressive types are now adopting very, I guess, traditional conservative arguments about civilization and race, rather than just trying to be kind of edgy and taboo breaking. So as transgression has played itself out, I think the mainstream itself has also kind of collapsed. I mean, this is perhaps not such a novel observation, but the idea of a mainstream doesn't exist. And I think there's two main reasons for that. One, the bourgeoisie has given up on upholding norms. And this is actually what the baby boomers actually did to society. They ended a kind of norm upholding idea of, in pursuit of kind of transgression, of difference, etc. And two, the kind of communication vehicles for sustaining the mainstream have completely fragmented, right? The mainstream media, which sustained an notion of mainstream, has fallen apart. Then there's a third way, I think, in which we can unpack the end of the 1960s, and that's that the precepts of the new left and its successors have been politically defeated. So the kind of rainbow coalition populism of kind of identity politics, various identities coming together, the idea that was probably most thoroughly theorized by Laclau and Mouffe at the end of the 1980s, and which became the kind of manual for the kind of left-wing populism through the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s especially, has been politically defeated, and I think it's being intellectually abandoned. That's probably the element which I'm least certain about, but I think that being past peak woke would be another index of the end of the 1960s. And then finally, the point made, just to refer to it again, by Christopher Lash's Angry Ghost, about people just being tired of an adversary culture and wanting order. And that would be a real break with the whole kind of cultural order that was instituted as of the 1960s and the kind of progressive consensus that existed everywhere from Britain to Brazil.
There's a lot to say on this, but I think it's a really good kind of question. And it was, as you were talking, it made me think, like, what were the 60s? So you had a lot of different things kind of coming together. You mentioned a few of them. This kind of, counterculture is incredibly important, and that kind of anti-authoritarianism, sexual freedom, the hippies. Like, there was an awful lot there. And one way that I was sort of thinking about this is, I think counterculture, I think Mark Fisher was right. Kurt Cobain was a good illustration of pre-corporation, this idea that there's no counterculture, you're already incorporated before you've even made that kind of countercultural gesture. And maybe the last place where the 60s were alive was in Silicon Valley until fairly recently. The combination in the California ideology of the yuppies and the hippies. And so I think maybe it is fairly recently, or more recently than I would have kind of given it credence, that the kind of the hippie element of like tech will save us, and macro dosing rather than micro dosing, LSE. It's only fairly recently, and you can
LSD?
yeah.
I microdosed LSD, but we're talking about microdosing LSD.
I said LSD, didn't I?
You? Okay.
You said LSE.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can macrodose LSD at LSE if you want to, or mesodose one and macrodose the other, whatever. I kind of lost my point a little bit. The hippies are no longer to be seen in the kind of California ideology, this idea of that tech will really save us. I think it's only fairly recently that the Owl of Minerva has really started flapping, because it's now really taken for granted this recent Sarah Wynne Jones, I think is her name, book on Facebook. It presents the banal truth that Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg are not like evil. They're just like banal, like business people. There's no kind of vestige of any sort of this hippie imagination. It's all the yuppies or maybe yuppies. And so, yeah, I think the question, instead of like, are the 60s finally ending, is like, where was the last place that they were alive? And I think it was Silicon Valley, and I think it's not alive there now. So yeah, I think there is, I don't know who's really carrying the banner forward of the 60s at this point, if anyone.
No, that's a really good observation about Silicon Valley, and I may have made this point before, but so I'll be brief. In Cédric Durand's book on techno-feudalism, which is the best one of the lot, even though he's wrong in the overall thesis, he has the best read of the Californian ideology and an imminent critique of it. And he points out, I mean, this is already him writing it, I think, in the original version in French in that, the Californian ideology has played itself out, and that the mood music and the rhetoric coming from Silicon Valley is much more traditionally oligarchic and much less about kind of disruption, much more about power rather than self-expression, and so on. So I guess it speaks much more traditional capitalist ruling class themes than the kind of disruptive countercultural one that we've known the Californian ideology to be, and which probably was at its expressed most forthrightly in probably sometime in the 2000s, as it started to drop its libertarian elements and become more established, but still carrying this kind of this supposedly alternative energy. Now it's just like the largest sector in contemporary capitalism the world over, and indeed tech isn't even a sector anymore. So I think that, yeah, it's another way of kind of underlining your point, George. Unless we have any final points on this, we're going to move on to your questions and comments from this month.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.